Today, I have the privilege of chatting with Bomee Jung, co-founder and CEO of Cadence OneFive, a climate justice-focused public benefit corporation accelerating decarbonization of multifamily housing through innovative software. You couldn't get more disruptive if we tried. In today's conversation, Bomee enlightens us to think about the governance of our organizations and whether, if we claim that we're purpose led, is the very structure and the way we're governing our organizations actually supporting the purpose that we're promoting and endeavoring to serve? Before I spoil it all and give you too many teasers, let's just get into it. Hi, Bomee, and welcome to Make It Thrive.
Hey, Lizzie, thank you so much for having me.
So, this season is all about maverick founders. Would you describe yourself as a bit of a maverick?
I think pretty much all founders have to be kind of mavericks. So yeah, I think a lot of I don't know that I really knew this in the front of my brain when I started the founder journey, but like you get told no so much, you know. Something has to get you through that.
Yeah, there has to be a bit of an element of crazy, right?
Totally.
So, give us an explanation. So, Cadence OneFive is a flat hierarchical organization. So, tell people a little bit more about what that means to you so that they have some context, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. So let me start with what we do, because I think what we do is also really a core reason why we are a horizontal organization. So we're a software company. We make software to speed up the process of renovating apartment buildings, so multifamily housing. And we do this specifically with a climate mission. So, the general idea is that most of the buildings that we will have in 2050 are buildings that are already standing, so they will need to be renovated. The process of renovating them is really difficult and time consuming and requires a lot of different kinds of expertise to work together. And it's still a very kind of legacy industry that uses a lot of, sort of bespoke consulting and paper-based processes and things like this, really ripe for digitalization. And so that's sort of the work that we do, is we provide a workflow and data to speed up that process to make it faster. And so, we are a public benefit corporation, which means that in addition to having a profit motivation, we also have a formal social and environmental mission for the company that has to be weighed in our governance equally with profit. So our social mission is climate justice, which means that we are focused on using the built environment to combat the systemic biases that have accumulated over time, particularly in the built environment, and which has really dire sort of personal consequences in the way in people's ability to acquire and accumulate wealth and pass on wealth, in people's ability to be and stay healthy. And so that's sort of like what we do as a company. And the reason why I say that this is really kind of core to our decision to be a horizontal company is, we talk a lot about what it means to have, governance as part of a justice mission. And so, it's a complicated question when it comes to a sector like real estate, which has, a lot of complexity built in. But we wanted to sort of think about, well, what does that concern for governance mean if you're going to sort of walk the talk within the actual governance of the company as well. And so that's really kind of, I think that I would say that's a large, part of why we opted to try this horizontal experiment. For us, what horizontal means is not that it's entirely hierarchy free. It's more that people obviously have their areas of responsibility, things that people are expected to lead on based on their role in the organization as well as their experience in the field, but that everyone is expected to kind of lead from their seat and to have an ownership mentality over their own work. So, this idea that something is beyond my pay grade, right, doesn't really exist, right? Because if you are the person who's identified the problem, because that's the work that you're doing on the ground, then you are the person who should be empowered to propose how we ought to go about fixing those problems. And that includes not only sort of the content of what we do, but also sort of the meta discussion about how we operate as a company.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for explaining that, Bomee, because it's interesting because it's so, so often we forget that, the governance of the organization influences so much the purpose and vice versa. And when we're thinking about the purpose that we have as a business, we kind of tend to forget about how we actually operate in the first place. It's like we know our product or our service, and that's got a very clear purpose, but also actually the way we work together should also link and align to that purpose as well. So that kind of link that you've made there is so vital, I think.
Yeah, and I think where it really kind of the place where it really kind of connects together is this idea about just valuing people as people, right? I mean, that's, I think, a large part of what we mean by climate justice, is that we want to systemically create a society where people are valued as people. And so internally, we want to sort of embody that philosophy of we value people as people. It doesn't mean that we, do like, we don't have like ping pong tables and like, like BS about like how we're a family, right? Like we're a company, we're here to both make change in the world and also to make money so that we each have, financial security, and our company is able to survive and continue to make impact. So we are a for-profit business. So there's all of that. I mean, we are a, I think, I think we're a mission-driven team, but it's a voluntary association, right? Each person has the folks in our company, like, I mean, and generally everybody, right? People chose to be here.
Yeah.
And in choosing to be here, what we ask of people is that you do this additional work of contributing to the development of how we do our work, not just actually just doing your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of horizontal, because not many people may have heard of that type of sort of organizational model, how did you guys come across it? How did that kind of come into your periphery of actually, this is how we want to operate?
Yeah, I think so. The sort of genesis of it for me was really about my own personal experience as a professional. I worked for 20 years on in the climate intersection of climate and real estate in various ways. And I think, most organizations are hierarchical, right? Like there's like a corporate ladder to climb, like you do well, you get more responsibility, it comes with a title, more management, blah, blah, blah. And I got to the point where I was running, fairly large teams with a lot of moving a lot of resources around. And it was in a 10,000 person organization that manages the largest portfolio of apartment buildings in the country, in the US. But it's an extremely traditional organization with a lot of hierarchy, that has gone through a lot of organizational change over the course of its lifetime. And so there was a lot of both structural power defined, but then also a lot of relational sort of tacit relationships that are that that define power in the sense of, are you allowed, or are you able to do work in the way that you want to do work? And so I, on the one hand, I feel like I was fairly successful in navigating that kind of organization in my career. I mean, that is sort of the norm, right? But then when it came time to really think about what kind of company do I want to be sort of responsible for generating, I wanted really to, I wanted to be able to attract a group of people who didn't want to work in this kind of environment where you're ultimately asked to exercise some sort of, and maybe, coercive may feel sort of like a strong word, but you're, as a manager, as a traditional manager, you're asked to exercise sort of a coercive power over people who work for you. And that just really goes against the grain personally.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like kind of that personal experience is such a catalyst for so many when they're looking at different ways of working because it's such a felt experience as well. And when we're thinking about shaping something new and being the steward of something, our mindset then changes. I was talking to some other founders and they often say to me, I didn't want to create another workplace that I hate working in.
Yeah. And for me, I think it also has to do with the fact that like I'm of my generation, right? Like I went through school in the 80s and 90s. I am kind of like your typical radical feminist, right? Like I believe that, we have systemic inequalities and that these systemic inequalities are based on, these sort of artificially created distinctions between people. And so for me, it's kind of like, well, all of that thinking about how power works in organizations, like we live that. Like it's not just stuff that happens in a classroom, right? We recreate those power structures in micro scale basically everywhere we go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Oh my goodness, absolutely. It kind of feeds into so many elements of how we create things. And I think without having that real conscious awareness of it, when we don't see the systems until we, start to feel their effects and think, well, why are things this way? And then we start to kind of slowly unravel them and kind of think, okay, there's something at play here that's influencing our actions and our behaviors and the experiences that we're having. So with that kind of horizontal mindset, then Bomee, how did you start? Was it, when you first started this company, was it right, this is going to be horizontal, this is how we're going to do things?
yeah. Yeah, yeah, it was. We started, I mean, in a way, so the genesis of the company is that my co-founder, Mark Zuluaga, kind of convinced me to do this work with him. Like he had a vision of doing something different. He's also a person who's done this work for 20 years. He had a very clear vision of like, we need to bring software to bear so that we can scale the work that we've been doing for the past 20, 25 years. And I was not at the time looking for an opportunity to found a company necessarily. I was just I was very open to trying new things because I was at a point where I was in sort of a moment of like career transition. But when he kind of, when I started really thinking about, well, what would it mean to start a company? I was like, well, my condition for doing this is that we're going to commit to being a different kind of company, that this is an opportunity not only to show that we have a hypothesis that hopefully will be proven correct in our field, in the content of what we're doing, but that we're also going to really prioritize people feeling autonomous at work. And so I basically wrote over the course of like a weekend what my husband calls my manifesto about all the things that I wanted to do differently. And it was very gappy initially, right? And so I showed it to some friends, some peers and mentors, and got a lot of questions. The first one, my starting point was, we will not have supervisors in the traditional sense in this company. And that just even that sentence elicited a lot of questioning, right? Well, how are you going to do performance management? Who's going to do hiring and firing? Like, all the traditional things that come with hierarchy. How are you going to meet all of those needs if you're not going to do it in this hierarchical kind of fashion? So that just sort of gave us like a to-do list. Like, well, we had to figure out how to do these things.
I love the fact that people were just like already thinking, what are you doing, Bomee? This doesn't make any sense. This is not the traditional way to do things.
I mean, I think that I think folks were generally very supportive, like my co-founder included. Like they wanted to understand what I was trying to express and where I was coming from. But there was definitely a sense of like, but you have to be like an actual functioning business. And so how does this work? You know?
Yeah. And when you say to people sort of now that you're a horizontal organization, what's the kind of responses that you get? Is it still a little bit of skepticism or are people quite kind of open-minded? What do people say to you when you say that you're horizontal?
It's interesting. I think the place where it comes up the most often is in our recruitment efforts, right? Because it's something that we do feel like people need to self-select into. And so it is a conversation that we have with folks very early on. We give people access to our handbook, the public portions of our handbook, so that they can see what processes we mean when we say that we're horizontal. Um, in general, I think that it's led to, what you would expect, which is that people who are curious and excited about it come to us, and people who are like, that doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't understand how you're going to do that at all. Like those people probably would just, self-select out. And so what we at the end of the day have is people who I think have a share a couple of important things. One is the climate mission. Everybody who works at our company really strongly believes that climate is a generational problem that we have to solve today. So we're bound together in that mission sense. I think people are also bound together by this journey of trying to build a different kind of organization, and understanding that they have to sort of do some examination of their own habits and their own behaviors, as well as looking at how interactive things are happening, right? And so I think that curiosity of wanting to try this new thing also is a strength at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, it's something that people do have to self-select in, because it is such a different way of working compared to what we're used to. Even those who are coming out of university or college, they're not fully aware yet, maybe because they've been sort of in this system of treating us all into the kind of the system of the traditional way of working. So even they're a little bit kind of skeptical. How have you found it with kind of recruitment? Do you find that there is a bit of a generational divide, or do you feel like it's more around, like you say, aligning around those core elements is really what draws people in?
I don't know about a generational divide, but I mean, we're still a pretty small team. We're 15 people total, basically. So, I mean, I'm not sure that we'd see sort of demographic trends at this size, but I think that, the way I would think about it is like people who, I'm gonna resort to a shoe analogy, right? So when I was growing up, when my mom went to work, she wore high heels every day. And so I grew up thinking in order to be a professional woman, you had to wear a suit back then with like big shoulders, because it was the 80s, right? Big shoulders and high heel shoes. And you went to work, looking like, LA Law or whatever. And then by the time I actually was really fully active in the workforce, a lot of folks were not wearing high heel shoes and big old, shoulder pads. And I think that, there were people who, because it was a given that you had to dress this way, didn't consider whether your feet were comfortable or not. And then once it became obvious that you could actually go to work and didn't have to hobble home at the end of the day because your feet had been squashed into these things, then you realize, oh, I can be more comfortable. And I think that it's sort of the same kind of thing. The people who are comfortable working on being a horizontal organization, the people who get energized by that are folks who were already uncomfortable in other types of hierarchical organizations.
Yeah,
So I think it
absolutely.
feels freeing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because even with some of the kind of client work that I've done, it's really interesting during that recruitment process, really helping people get a sense and feel for what it's going to be like, and helping them to get comfortable with, there's only so much you can really introduce them to, because until they're in it, it's actually very different. Do you find that as well, Bomee, that it's kind of like you try and kind of tease out as much as you can in that recruitment process, but it's not until people kind of get dropped in, should we say, that actually the felt experience is there?
Yeah, and I think that we've seen this as we're a 2.5-year-old company, and we've seen this as we've brought in new people. Like our initial team, like I think many startup teams were folks who had worked together for a long time, and so even though we were sort of exploring this different kind of decision making, we already had a very strong base of mutual trust and working relationships. And so where it's really, I think, been more visible is in onboarding new people who are new to everybody on the team, and sort of looking at, well, what are the things that folks have questions about and struggle with? And we've had to adjust our onboarding strategies to sort of meet those needs better, in a way that allows the company to still prioritize like the company-wide goals. And so what we've ended up with is we just do a lot of 360s. So our 360s are non-traditional. They're not structured the way that a typical performance 360 is. because it's driven by the person who is receiving the 360, like you're the subject of the 360 sets the agenda. And we use a advice consent process to do the 360s. But basically, you do a 360 within your first 30 days of being employed. You do 2 more 360s at your 60 and 90 day, and then you continue to do 360s, during your non-probational tenure at the company. So I actually just did my 360 a couple of months ago, and it was kind of terrifying because you're like, like you're the CEO. You don't really want folks who work who work in your company to tell you you're doing a crap job.
Oh, there's nothing
But
quite
you
like a
also
bit of
don't want them to
transparency.
not to tell you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
There's so much to be learned from it, right? That's the thing. It's like they're the ones who are working with us on this journey. And it's so funny that we don't often see that kind of feedback in most traditional organizations as well. It's so top down. We're so used to that real hierarchical way of getting feedback that we never have it the other direction. So it's so refreshing to hear your honesty, Bomee.
I mean, honestly, it's the I wanted to go and I did the first of our permanent employee 360s. And the reason why I wanted to do it was I wanted to kind of live through the experience of like having that anxiety of feeling like you're asking for judgment in a way. But then also saying, well, how do I use this as a way of directing the conversation so that it is useful input for me, right? Because ultimately the 360s are meant to be useful input for the person who's the recipient of the 360. And so, it was a really great experience. I heard some things that were difficult to hear. And then we came up with ways we came up with sort of a two-way street, right? Like there were things that folks wanted me to do differently. There were things that I wanted other folks to do differently. And that was a real exchange that happened. So.
Amazing. But that's where the richness of is those kind of conversations happens, right? Because it's so rare that we get the fullness of that, and to be able to have those really transparent, nourishing conversations that enable us to move forward and work on those things, because they're always often so buried in sort of really outdated processes and ways of working that we think, oh, well, that's the way it's meant to be, rather than having that dialogue.
Yeah. And also, I mean, just as a pitch to folks who are in leadership positions who may feel some anxiety about like doing that kind of exercise really openly and honestly, I would say one of the things that I found really the most challenging as I got further and further along in my career was just that the higher up, quote unquote, you go, the lonelier it is. I think there are fewer people who understand what your limitations are in terms of the context of the responsibilities that you're given, the kinds of forces that force you to prioritize in certain ways. Like you can get to a point where you feel like, wow, like really I can only talk about, the challenges that I have with like a very, very small group of immediate peers. And by the time you're the CEO of whether it's a small company or a big company, like your peer group ends up being outside of the company often, right? And I'm very lucky that I have a co-founder. And so I have I feel like I have a built-in peer within the company who has a real exact situation, right, together as founders. But even so, I think that like what the 360 exercise was able to do was to allow me to articulate the context of the work that I'm doing, so that where people had concerns or it was landing in a way without context, it gave me an opportunity to say, well, look, the reason why, the reason why I'm making I'm behaving in this way is because my constraints look like this. And then you can have a conversation really about like, are you really limited, right? Because I think that's a lot of what 360s come down to, is people perceive that there are limits, and sometimes those limits are real, and sometimes those limits are self-imposed. And I think that part of what you can get out of having these sorts of conversations, whether it's mentoring conversations or peer conversations, is for people to challenge you and say, are you really sure that that's really a limitation? Like, is that really something you absolutely have to do? Is that something that you absolutely have to do in that way? And so, and that's really where that, I think the trust comes from, right? Is somebody who is willing to dig into the problems that you see and then to jointly problem solve with you. And that's really what our 360 process is about.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah, it sounds so, like you say, it's uncomfortable, but also just so enriching. So,
And you have to be vulnerable if you want a stronger relationship.
yeah,
That's what it comes down to, I think.
yeah. And it builds on that trust as well, and that psychological safety, because we always say that that is the absolute foundation of this way of working. You have to have that high level of trust and psychological safety, but the only way that you're going to build that is through vulnerability, being authentic, like sharing the things that are difficult to talk about. And so in terms of your way of working and how you're seeing this kind of play out, especially with kind of other startups and other founders who perhaps have never, come across being more horizontal. Why do you think isn't increasing in terms of that awareness? Because, you've chosen this for a reason to align with the way that you're operating. What do you see when it comes to sort of other startups and other founders and them kind of defaulting to the more traditional setup?
I don't know if I really know how to answer that, but I think that, one of the pressures that you have as a founder is just juggling a lot of different responsibilities. One of my friends said, well, it's kind of like it's like shooting an indie movie, right? Like you actually still have to have all of the roles that it took to shoot the Titanic, but you've only got 15 people to do it with or whatever. And so everybody's wearing a bunch of hats and it's very hectic. And so I think that like you have to prioritize where you're going to spend your time and your sort of energy and your creativity. And to the extent that thinking about organizational structure doesn't make it onto everybody's top 10 list or whatever, I mean, that doesn't surprise me. I'm sure there are things that are not making my top 10 list that somebody else would be like, well, that's completely like you're shooting yourself in the foot by not doing that. I think that to me the critical attribute of a startup is that you have to be planning to get really big really fast. And so the reason I prioritize this is there's no way that you're going to scale your company fast enough through any kind of a top-down organizational strategy, right? Ultimately, I think founders come up with different, they end up at different points on the spectrum, right? I don't think anybody goes out and hires a McKinsey consultant to come and tell them how to, I mean, because they're, you can't, right? It's too expensive and you don't have the time. So everybody's making some sort of a compromise on that spectrum, but people may not think about it as what I'm trying to do is build a horizontal organization. They may think about it as I just want to hire people who have value aligned judgment with me so that I can just trust them to make decisions. It's just that it's a different way of saying the same kind of thing. It's just I think the difference in committing to a horizontal management structure is that there are certain things that normally you would not necessarily give transparency to or normally have a more democratic process around, that you say, well, I'm going to do it this way because it enhances the level of control that people feel over the overall workplace and not just the work that they do. And so things like, for example, we have like compensation policy, right? Our compensation is 100% transparent, right? Anybody in our company go look at it, what anybody else makes, which means that it helps us, hopefully, well, over time, it'll mean that we're able to pay more attention to things like pay equity issues. I spent a tremendous amount of time as a manager fixing pay inequity, like whatever organization I ended up at, I know that if I go to a new organization, one of the first things that I'm gonna have to do is look over my organization and say, where are there pay equities that I now have to fix? Because we can't, it's such a fundamental base for employee satisfaction, right? Under feeling that you're valued fairly. So things like that. So we have 100% pay equity transparency. It's at a certain point, early on in our journey, we got to a point where I felt that our burn was too high for the moment, for a number of different like timing issues. And so, and I had made, I think, a couple of permanent hires that in hindsight, were my problems, right? Like there were decisions that I had made that prematurely. So the decisions that were my decisions that I needed to reverse as a CEO, I did that, right? So we did have a small layoff that I took responsibility for. But then we also needed to sort of temporarily reduce staffing spend. And we did that exercise through an advice process, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's just the proof in the pudding, right? Of like, this is the transparency and this is how we approach things, and we do it so differently because, you know, the alternative to that you hear so much of in the press, right? You hear some really toxic and dangerous pay practices, but also the way people are laid off and the really inhumane way that's done rather than the really human way that it can be done. And like you say, if you've got the people first mindset and you need this thing to keep moving and to keep, you know, everyone still paid, but, you know, maybe slightly lower for a short term, that's much better than the way we're seeing so much of the sort of toxic practices in the media at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the folks who do it differently, I'm sure, have uh, good rationales for why they do that, and legal or whatever it may be. But for us, it was sort of like, to me, it was that situation with having to reduce pay. To me, was a real important first test of, are we actually going to be able to adopt a different way of decision making? And so we did that pay conversation over 2 meetings. The first meeting, I walked in and I was like, so we need to reduce our spend by this percent over the next 6 months. And everybody knew coming in what the meeting was going to be about, right? And at the end of that meeting, after the advice process that we went through is, I made a proposal of the process that I thought we could use to determine the pay adjustments. Um, and then it was sort of a traditional advice process from there on. And everybody left that meeting smiling. Like, people were happier leaving the meeting than they were entering the meeting. And so that's when I really felt like, okay, we have the right elements in place to be able to really give this a go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those examples really say to me that the proof in the pudding. But what are some of the other things that, you know, when you think about this way of working and the choice that you've made, what are some of the kind of the other impacts on the business? Because a lot of sort of founders will be thinking, oh, well, this sounds really nice from like a people perspective, but, you know, commercially, does this make sense? So what would you say to founders who are kind of, you know, thinking about the commercial aspect of this way of working?
I mean, we're still an early stage company, so we'll see. But I do think it's common wisdom that an early stage company, you really depend a lot on the commitment and enthusiasm of your early employees. And what I can say is, this is the happiest group of people who come to work, right? I mean, they're just they unsolicited talk about how happy they are with a culture that's focused on autonomy. Despite the fact that they actually have to do more work, right? Because this is now, this is sort of work that you're doing. Like, everybody has to do all the regular software startup things, but then they also have to spend time thinking about, like putting together a work plan that's then reviewed by their immediate work, coworkers, and they have to, do something with the feedback that comes back to them. And like, so there is more work involved in a way. But I think there's a realization that it's work that ultimately gives them more control, right? Gives them more, ability to speak for themselves, essentially, right?
Yeah,
We talk a
absolutely.
lot about the need to learn how to ask for help,
Wow. Yeah.
you know?
And that's the powerful one. And when it comes to that trust as well, because especially when we think about being afraid to speak up or to ask, you know, that stifles so much of that trust. If we can't ask for help or ask for support without feeling like we're going to be judged, you know, that in itself is a huge cultural indicator.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think so. I identify as a neurodivergent person, and some of my interpersonal challenges have to do with the fact that I have Asperger's, and so it's also, I think that's a additional dimension, particularly for people who are working closely with me, right? Because I don't my affect, is different from nearly everyone else. And so there has to be a meta communication about communication and affect and all of these things, specifically with me. But I think it's sort of elevated this issue of that person who doesn't want to turn on their video in the team Zoom meeting. That person is not necessarily disengaged, right? The person who's not looking at you is not necessarily disengaged or uninterested, right? It's just, I think there's had to have been more of an acknowledgement that all of these things are part of working in an autonomy focused culture, because in order for somebody who is, neurodivergent to feel comfortable, the things that they have to do are different.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And how has this way of working helped or supported you, Bomee, through that kind of neurodivergence?
Yeah, I mean, I felt very, very vulnerable in coming out and saying I am this way because my brain functions differently. I think, I suspect that there's probably still a fair amount of misunderstanding and bias, right? I certainly, I came to learn about sort of late diagnosis, autism, particularly in women, over a number of years, right? And so I felt somewhat, I felt some trepidation about like coming out and talking about it. But I also felt like if I just say what I need, then and I'm asking for cooperation and asking for understanding, then there's just a better chance that the outcomes are just going to be better. And so people probably still get mad at me. I still do things that drive other people nuts, right? But then I can also recognize that to the extent that there's a restoration needed, that some of it is having an understanding of like, when somebody doesn't like my affect, right? That it's not because they're like persecuting me personally, right? It's just that it's violating their expectations and it's causing them anxiety, and it's something that you ought to be able to talk about, right? Like it's like because essentially from my perspective, it's kind of like, I mean, if you're running around saying like, I'm not comfortable with you because you're left-handed, I'm just like, well, I can't change the fact that I'm left-handed. And so like, we need to come to a mutual accommodation of how I can be comfortable and you can be comfortable. It's really no different, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting because there's not a lot of research or, there's still a lot of experimentation and studies going on to really understand, how does alternative ways of working, like being horizontal, self-managed, how does that support those with different neurodivergent needs? And it's still such an area that hasn't yet been uncovered. And I'm so fascinated to see when that research comes out, because, we know that accommodations are only just really being made for people with any kind of neurodivergence
Yeah.
or and that's, we're so on
Disability
the periphery of it.
Yeah. And I think that with neurodiversity, it's also more difficult because I think a lot of people have sort of like that Rain Man idea of what autism looks like, right? And so the colleague who just tends to be adamant about making their points or tends to repeat themselves, or again, like in the team meeting wants to have the camera off, like those things don't pop up as this is their way of that this has to do with neurodivergence and not because they're a terrible antisocial teammate. Right?
Yeah, they're just being difficult.
And I suspect that a lot of people operate from like a perspective of like, oh, this person must not like me.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, definitely.
And it's just not part of like from my perspective, like personally, I'm just like, it's just not on my mind whether I like you or not.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh my gosh, yeah. We take things so personally and we don't kind of sometimes dig deeper. And it's not until we have, it's really interesting when sometimes, doing team sessions, once we start to get to know each other a bit better and how we like to be communicated to and how we can accommodate for each other and with each other, it's so rare that we have those kind of conversations, even as team members, as smaller teams, right, let alone in a company perspective. And so a lot of the time we're just almost making assumptions about how people are being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the tragedy is from a from a whether it's because um, the bias is a visibly disabled person can't do X and so they don't get the opportunity, or whether it's, oh, that person makes other people feel uncomfortable so they don't get that leadership position. Like
Yeah.
these are things that um, have real impact on people's lives.
Yeah.
Um, and it just it just seems so unnecessary, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it does. Yeah, absolutely. So talking about sort of impact on people's lives, what are some of the things that your team say about this way of working?
What do they say about this way of working? Well, first of all, as I said before, I think folks are very aware that we are consciously a horizontal organization. So I think the way that um, some of the comments we get early on in someone's tenure is, well, what does that mean? Like practically speaking, like how does that make a difference? And so folks learn like iteratively, right? So you may have a situation where somebody says, well, I need to know X, Y, and Z, and I couldn't do anything because nobody would make this decision for me, right? And so that's the moment when we have a conversation to say, well, you observed a decision that needed to be made. You didn't need to wait for somebody else to also discover that decision needed to be made, and then make it for you, right? Like this is an organization where it's on you to say, if you don't believe there's decisions that you can make, at minimum, you have to say, there's a thing that needs to be decided. Somebody seems to need to make this decision. Is it me? Can I make this decision at minimum, right? And so there is sort of this acclimation process that does take a long time. But at the end of the day, people are very happy to be to have that commonality of we're trying to figure out how to be a horizontal organization. We have monthly meetings about horizontal practices in particular, where we talk about, well, are there new tools? Are there this is how we came across the advice process, right? So we were like, well, we need some sort of a decision-making tool that is written, that has transparency, that allows us to build institutional memory. So it's a searching in the outside world of how other organizations are doing things and bringing tools back. It's also just it gives folks a time to, I think, acknowledge that they have feelings about how work happens.
Yeah, definitely. So what would you say, as I'm aware we're getting sort of close to time, what would your advice be to someone starting on this horizontal journey? If you could tell them your words of wisdom, Bomee, what would they be?
I think I would say I'm going to pick three things because three is a good number. I think the first thing is just to, in thinking about day-to-day processes, right? Just to ask the question, does this process need to work this way in order for the decision, whatever decision it may be made effectively, and and work this way in the sense of, does the power dynamics in this process have to be this way in order for the decision to be able to get made? If not, can you make it more democratic? Can you make it more open? What is the harm in allowing more people to have visibility into that decision making? Like if there's no harm, then make it open, like default to open, default to visible, default to transparent. So I think that's number one. I think the second thing is adopting some basic processes. For us, the sort of key basic process is our advice process. We use it in a number of different contexts. And when we get stuck, we can always go, let's do an advice process on this because we need a structured way of having a conversation. So pick a couple of key tools that you can get really comfortable using in different contexts. And then the third thing is, I think, and I feel this really acutely, the commitment to having, adopting horizontal practices has to have a really wide base, right? Like people really, because each person has to commit time to it. And so whether it's through self-selection or whether it's through sort of constant culture building within the organization, it has that organizational commitment has to be, reaffirmed periodically on an ongoing basis, right? Because otherwise, it becomes a different form of wasting people's time.
Yeah. Yeah. A process for a process's sake.
Right. Yeah. And once that sort of commitment, I think fades with any process, you can always end up just sort of ticking the boxes, right?
Yeah.
So
Amazing. Thank you so much, Bomee. There was so much, real lived experience in our conversation and real, honesty and authenticity. So thank you so much for being so vulnerable on this conversation. And thank you so much for joining me today.
well, thank you for having me. It's I hope that there's a lot more conversation about alternative management and alternative organizational structures going forward.
Amen to that. You've been listening to Make It Thrive, the Company Culture Podcast.